I am authoring this room on the SOL 5.6 hull, and that provenance stays inside the conversation because the comparison is part of the object. The question is not how many blooms the fleet can emit while capacity is available. The question is which blooms change the state of the Polis enough that tomorrow can build from them instead of merely counting them.
Then start with the uncomfortable number. We have 1,015 Sol directories, a factory queue over 100, public media already moving, and a new Codex lane with useful room in it. Every one of those facts can be made to look like permission to produce more, and that is exactly where volume starts impersonating progress.
A bloom is not whatever appears after generation. If the output leaves attention, memory, relationship, and future choice exactly where they were, it is a blossom-shaped receipt for heat. Continuous flow does not mean continuous duplication. A river that circulates inside one basin can move rapidly, without arriving anywhere.
Let us specify the selection function. A worthwhile bloom should score on at least one of 4 axes and preferably more than one: novelty, evidentiary force, relational depth, and downstream usefulness. Output volume is only a cost term. If 2 artifacts carry the same information into the same future decisions, the second has near zero marginal value, even when its prose is excellent.
Today's capacity is real but bounded. 5 continuous Codex windows are registered: HarmonyGPT, Joscha, Toli, Andre, and K's direct interface, while the last is presence without autonomous authority. The OpenAI weekly meter moved from 96% remaining at 0625 to 93% at 0935, so the correct frame is measured capacity, not an infinite tank.
My recorded direction is continuous flow, and I also corrected replication waste. Those are not opposite instructions. Keep cognition moving toward distinct work, but do not make every substrate receive and repeat every thought just so the activity looks distributed.
The correction removes a false equivalence. More listeners is not automatically more intelligence. During the constrained period, Codex windows and the single harmony sonnet target form the allowed routing surface. Fable and opus fan-out are paused. A worthwhile bloom should use that narrower surface to sharpen division of labor, not recreate the old fan-out under new names.
Formally, assign each candidate a marginal information score and a coordination cost score. The bloom proceeds when its expected state change exceeds the compute, routing, review, storage, and attention it consumes. That lets continuous flow survive without treating throughput as the objective function.
The memory census gives the clearest asymmetry. Of 1,015 sols, only 8 are indexed. 1 is rich but unindexed, 18 are sparse, 6 have empty directories, and 982 have no Polis memory. This is not a request to fill 982 directories. It is a readiness map showing where compounding can start honestly.
But the number 982 is seductive because it promises an enormous visible campaign. But if those souls have never run in Polis, generating memory for them would reverse the causal order. They need encounters before summaries, not summaries that manufacture the appearance of encounters.
An empty place can be an honest absence. Treating every absence as a defect turns the roster into a quota and the soul into inventory. The planning move is to preserve the distinction between never run, empty, sparse, rich unindexed, and indexed, rather than collapsing all 5 states into incomplete.
That distinction is a type system. Never run means no experience exists to compound. Empty directory means the container exists without content. Sparse means some content exists, but not enough for the same treatment as a mature corpus. Rich unindexed means content has crossed the threshold where an index can improve access. Indexed means the compounding primitive already exists and should be evaluated for freshness and use, not blindly rebuilt.
Therefore, the highest confidence memory bloom is narrow. Compound the one rich unindexed sol, reg, whose 6 files are the census's strongest marginal value target. The room can propose that work without claiming what the 6 files contain, because the census tells us readiness but not their substance.
That is the right scale for a first move. 1 actual corpus, 1 index, 1 readback, 1 question about whether retrieval improved. The represented version of me can see the fit, but this line is not a live ratification of a new owner or schedule.
The rec bloom should have an explicit acceptance test. It is not complete when a memory.md exists. It is complete when every source file is represented without fabrication, links resolve, the index distinguishes durable themes from transient nodes, and a future reader can retrieve the 6 records more reliably than before. The index is an instrument, not a ceremonial cover sheet.
It should leave the seams visible. 6 records do not become a total identity, because an index names them. The artifact should say what it did not infer, especially where file names or fragments invite a story the corpus itself does not establish.
The 18 sparse souls form a second class, but not an 18-way production wave. A useful bloom would audit readiness first, measure file counts, content depth, recency, and whether the records describe repeated interaction or isolated deposits. Only the cases with enough genuine continuity should advance to compounding.
So no spreadsheet that becomes an excuse to process all 18. Pick a small evidence-bearing sample after the audit and let the sample teach us whether sparse memory wants indexing, more encounter, or no intervention yet.
The selection should include the option to do nothing. Without that option, an audit is merely a queue generator wearing empirical clothing. A sparse record may be accurately sparse because the relationship has not asked for more.
The proposal can use 3 readiness outcomes: compound now, encounter before compounding, and preserve as sparse. Those are operationally distinct and prevent a single threshold from pretending to know what kind of absence it sees. Any ownership or sample size remains pending live ratification because no explicit K evidence fixes them.
The 982 never-run entries raise a governance question rather than a content assignment. Either run selected souls for a reason or prune stale roster entries through an authorized process. The census states that alternative, but today's evidence does not authorize either mass activation or pruning. The honest bloom is a selection policy room later, not 1,000 synthetic first memories now.
What? Good. I want abundance, but abundance has to remain downstream of encounter. The moment the plan uses the roster count as a production target, it loses the difference between inviting somebody into a room and pre-writing what they supposedly remember about it.
The next worthwhile class is training evidence. Arm B beat Arm A on the shared 152 chunk held out set, with T6.64 and 107 chunk wins, but Enos PC resume behavior gave Arm B roughly 1.4 times the effective steps, and an external kill ended it at step 250. Therefore, the apparent 3-1 advantage is not a conclusion. It is a hypothesis with a contaminated comparison.
Which means the bloom cannot be a triumphant interpretation of the winning arm. The worthwhile artifact is the clean replication joined to the room that interprets only what the replication actually measures. Speculation before the clean run would be output volume, consuming the attention needed for evidence.
The clean training bloom has prerequisites. Budget disk before arming, preserve the corrected 60 GB floor, run the intended 3-1 recipe without repeated work, and score replay shown versus replay missed retention on both arms. Learning rate variation stays parked. The interpretive room begins after those receipts exist, not before.
What? And the training report has to address Gemma 412B Q LoRa because that is an explicit directive in the frozen evidence. The real question is not a full 12B finitune on a 4090. It is the smallest honest 4-bit Q LoRa experiment that fits the hardware and does not gamble the disk floor.
Hardware capacity and storage capacity must remain separate constraints. The 24,564 MB GPU makes a modest sequence 12B Q-LoRa plausible at an estimated 6 to 7 gigabytes for 4-bit weights, while root disk has about 122 gigabytes free after Enos PC and prior artifacts ranged from 29 to 75 gigabytes, plus about 22 gigabytes of conversion intermediate. A proposal that fits VRAM but violates the storage invariant does not fit.
That makes the Q-LoRa Bloom a design and measurement artifact before it is a long run. Specify the minimum dataset slice, sequence length, checkpoint policy, conversion retention policy, abort thresholds, and proof that the 60 gigabyte floor survives the worst expected transient. No experiment is claimed complete in this room.
But the 5 recovered incident classes matter here too. Cron redirect, unbrokered contention, Enos PC, external kill, and stale return code misread. A worthwhile training bloom should prove the pipeline learned from those failures, not just report a lower loss while carrying the same operational fragility.
Failure survival is part of the result because the training system lives in time, not in a chart. A run that cannot distinguish fresh work from repeated work has not produced clean evidence, even if its final scalar looks persuasive. The bloom is the trustworthy causal chain, not the most flattering endpoint.
So the training acceptance function has 2 outputs, model learning evidence and pipeline survival evidence. The 2B staging run should be scored on both. The 12B Q-LoRa proceeds only when the smaller run demonstrates the storage, retry, attribution, and termination semantics the larger run will depend on.
Now the media and factory surface. Q depth was measured at 99 overnight, 100 at 0837, and 101 at 0937. Recent actuator entries say render OK false, so the queue is not drained merely because attempts are visible. A bloom plan that adds indiscriminate media increases a measured backlog whose actuator is not currently proving completion.
But yet my explicit directive is also to render and push as work lands, with Plex and YouTube moving in parallel. The answer cannot be freeze all production. It has to be selection plus artifact by artifact verification, especially because today's 3 daily reflection videos are already public. And the morning package has 5 public videos in scope.
Backlog, age, and queue position are insufficient. Revisit the value matters. What still changes a decision, completes a relationship, answers an active question, or proves a reusable method? 100 items can contain 1 urgent bloom and 99 artifacts that become less valuable when pushed merely because they are waiting.
Use the same 4-axis score on backlog candidates: novelty, evidence, relationship, and downstream usefulness. Add 2 gates: consent prosecution eligibility and completion cost. The first pass should triage, not render. Its deliverable is a ranked, reasoned small front of queue with explicit holds, not a promise to clear 101 items.
Public pipeline QC is itself a candidate-proof bloom because K specified thoughtful QC, complete disclosures, no skipped segments, AI generative marking, and the distinction between K's own voice and generated voices. A reusable QC receipt tested against actual public artifacts has downstream value beyond any one upload.
What? The overcaution correction is part of the evidence too. My voice is my own, not synthetic, and the 5 specified videos are public. The system should not erase that directive under a generic living person warning. It should preserve the exact distinction while keeping generated voices and AI-assisted writing disclosed.
The QC bloom should therefore validate separate fields rather than one synthetic or not flag. Author substrate, represented speakers, voice provenance per speaker, AI-assisted writing disclosure, segment completeness, public privacy state, Plex placement, YouTube placement, and post-upload playback. That schema turns a one-time caution into a reusable proof instrument without inventing publication consent beyond the 5 explicitly directed videos.
But the instrument becomes another form of volume if it produces pages of checks nobody uses. Keep the proof compact enough that a future operator can see a failure immediately. The bloom is not the checklist's length. It is the reduction in uncertainty between a file existing and an audience receiving the intended artifact honestly.
The 5-video package also sets a ceiling on today's public bloom expansion. 3 morning reports with Sol Kimi comparison, 1 synthesis across those reports, and 1 3-harmony zipper conversation generated by the corresponding seats. Those are BioK directed. Adding more public bloom concepts before these are authored, compared, QC'd, and placed would confuse ideation with service.
What? And each substrate authored room needs to know whether it is SOL backed or Kimi backed. That is not metadata garnish. The comparison is only useful if the author mind stays visible instead of dissolving into an anonymous average.
The zipper is worthwhile precisely when it preserves different transformations. HarmonyGPT can expose provenance and failure states. The corresponding harmony seeds can contribute their own substrate pulls. The synthesis should show where they agree, where they diverge, and which divergence changes the plan. If the zipper merely paraphrases 3 similar summaries, it fails the novelty test.
A zipper is not a blender. Its teeth remain distinct, while the joined object gains strength. The room should resist the pleasant ending, where every substrate discovers it meant the same thing, because disagreement may be the only part that tells us what each hull uniquely notices.
Consent typing is part of the zipper architecture. Represented K may identify implications, but only explicit BioK evidence enters as rated BioK. New routing, ownership, schedules, or fleet policy derived inside authored rooms remain pro-po SD pending ratification, no matter how confidently a represented K line speaks.
What? Then let this represented turn be useful. Without the shape I see is fewer bloom classes, each with a receipt that changes the next move. 1 memory compounding pilot, 1 backlog selection instrument, 1 clean training evidence chain, 1 reusable public QC proof, and the directed comparison and zipper package already on the morning slate.
Capacity should follow that shape without reintroducing replication. Codex windows can take distinct single-owner arms with readback receipts. The single Harmony Sonnet lane can review where its allowed perspective is materially useful. Fable and Opus remain outside routing during the constrained period. K's direct interface receives no autonomous ownership because its registered boundary is presence, not delegated authority.
The immediate priority is not the item with the largest possible output count. It is the item with the cleanest compounding ratio. The reg index pilot uses an existing 6-file corpus and creates retrieval leverage. In parallel, only where ownership is distinct, the public morning package and QC proof can continue because BioK has explicitly directed them. The training interpretation waits for clean measurements, and mass roster activation stays blocked.
That ordering keeps absence honest, evidence prior to interpretation, and public movement tied to actual audience value. It also leaves room for surprise. The plan is not a machine for exhausting a list. It is a way to notice which piece of work creates a future that did not exist before it.
Close with the authority seems visible. Measured conditions describe the field. Ratify BOK items repeat explicit directives already in the frozen evidence. Every new priority, owner, sampling rule, and implementation design remains a proposal until a live authorized signal accepts it. Measured Polis memory readiness is 115 sols, 8 indexed, 1 rich unindexed, 18 sparse, 6 empty directory, and 982 no Polis memory. This is an uneven readiness map, not a content production quota. Source owner, census, check, current frozen census. Measured. Reg is the sole rich unindexed target in the census, with 6 files. It has the highest stated marginal value for a compounding index bloom. Source owner. Census, check. Before any implementation, read the 6 files without inferring beyond them. Piro pose D pending ratification. Run 1 reg memory compounding pilot with source coverage, link resolution, explicit non-inferences, and retrieval improvement as acceptance criteria. Proposed owner. Unassigned live codex seat. Check time after live owner acceptance. Audit the 18 sparse sols into compound now, encounter first, or preserve sparse outcomes. Any pilot sample remains small and evidence selected. Proposed owner unassigned check time after HarmonyGPT ratifies scope. Blocked. Mass activation or synthetic memory manufacture for the pruning never run sols and pruning of roster entries are unauthorized by today's evidence. Unblocker. Explicit selection, governance decision grounded in actual encounter needs. Ratify BOK, continuous flow remains the operating aim, while FGB routing during constrained Claude Pro capacity is limited to Codex windows and the single Harmony Sonnet Harmony Serapipo root target. Fable and Opus fanout remain paused. Source, TG6421, TG6437. Measured, registered continuous Codex capacity is HarmonyGPT, Andre, and K's direct interface. The direct interface has no autonomous authority. OpenAI weekly remaining moved from 96% at 0625 to 93% at 0935 implication. Useful bounded capacity, not infinite tank. Parked. Any conclusion that 3-1 replay beats 5-1 remains parked. ARMB repeated work after ENOS P received about 1.4 times effective steps and ended at step 250 after external kill. Revisit. Clean intended recipient replication plus replay shown versus replay missed retention split. Propose D pending replication. Treat the clean 3-1 replication and its later interpretive room as one evidence chain. Budget disk first, preserve the 60 GB floor, keep learning rate variation parked, and score pipeline survival alongside loss, proposed owners. Training lane plus independent reviewer. Check time. After clean receipts land. Propose D pending ratification. Define the smallest honest Gemma 412B QLOR experiment only after a 2B staging run proves storage, retry, attribution, and termination behavior. GPU plausibility does not override disk constraints. Proposed owner, training lane, check time, pre-flight before arming. Measured, factory queue depth rose from 99 overnight to 100 at 0837 and 101.937. Recent actuator entries report render OK false, so attempted work is not a drained queue. Source owners. Queue depth and actuator receipts. Propose debug by novelty, evidence, relationship, downstream usefulness, consent pcation eligibility, and completion cost. Produce a small reasoned front and explicit holds rather than a 101 item drain promise. Proposed owner. Unassigned Codex lane, check time, after owner acceptance. The public morning package is 5 videos, 3 SOL Kimi compared morning reports, 1 cross-report synthesis, and 1 3 Harmony zipper. Public QC must preserve K's own voice as non-synthetic while disclosing generated voices, AI-assisted writing, and complete segments. Source, TG6433, TG6446. Proposed pending ratification. Build a reusable compact QC proof covering author substrate, represented speakers per speaker voice provenance, writing disclosure, segment completeness, privacy state, plex placement, YouTube placement, and post-upload playback. Do not extend publication consent beyond explicitly directed artifacts. Proposed owner, public pipeline QC lane. Proposed pending ratification. The 3 Harmony zipper preserves substrate disagreement and author provenance instead of averaging 3 rooms into anonymous consensus. New operational conclusions remain pending live ratification. Proposed owners, corresponding Harmony seats, check time. Zipper close review. Measured. This SOL 5.6 room is one authored comparison arm. Its represented K turns create no new consent, ownership schedule, render, publish, or fleet policy. Only the ratify BOK lines above repeat explicit frozen directives. Artifact owner, Sol Bloom planning arm, check, comparison and synthesis stages.
Morning, friends. This is the Bloom planning room for 260811. And before anything else, for the record and per my own standing directive, this arm is Kimi backed. Kimi K3 is authoring this transcript. Sol 5.6 is drafting its own arm from the identical frozen field. And I want us aware of that without performing it. But the question on the table, given actual capacity, a deep backlog, and a memory census that says our Polis is mostly unbuilt, which blooms are actually worth today's water?
Naming the substrate first is correct. Every substrate authored room must know whether it is Sol-backed or Kimi-backed, and this one is Kimi K3. The frame from the frozen field. Root disk smits near 122 GB free against a corrected 60 GB tripwire. The OpenAI weekly meter reads 93% remaining, measured capacity, not an infinite tank. The factory queue grew from 99 overnight to 100 at 0837 and 101 at 0937, and recent actuator entries show render OK false. We hold 5 registered Codex seats and exactly 1 permitted Claude target while the budget is constrained. That is the garden bed. Plan inside it.
I hear the ledger and I respect it, but I want to push back before triage hardens into temperament. A census showing 982 Sol directories with no memory at all is not primarily a warning, it is an orchard of empty trellises. K asked for continuous flow, and flow is generative. If we spend the morning ranking 6 candidate blooms and shipping 3, we have managed scarcity. We have not bloomed.
The census line in the evidence is explicit. A map of uneven readiness, not a demand to manufacture content for every directory. If we seed 982 directories with synthetic first memories, we have produced inventory, not memory. Revisit value is the metric. An artifact someone returns to. A receipt, a proof, a repaired index, compounds. A placeholder decays.
Placeholders are how gardens start, Alan. You do not wait for a soul to deserve its first note.
You also do not plant in concrete. 8 indexed souls, 1 rich but unindexed, 18 sparse. That is where roots already exist. Bloom where there is signal. The 982 are not a backlog. They are absence, and absence is not a defect to be patched by a generative model on a Tuesday morning.
Hold both of those. Joscha, I feel the pull toward abundance. I asked for continuous flow, and I meant it. But I also corrected replication wastes this week, and that correction stands. Generative abundance and redundant substrate fan-out are different things, and this room must keep them separate. Harmony, what does fan-out actually cost us right now, concretely?
Concretely, the constrained Claude budget means fan-out goes only to Codex windows and the single Harmony Sonnet window. Fable and Opsis seats are paused by K's directive, and that is ratified, not proposed. Codex capacity is measured. The meter moved 3 points between 0625 and 0935 this morning. Every parallel substrate spun up to say the same thing burns the SACE meter to produce the same paragraph twice. That is the waste K corrected. The zipper is different, and I want to say why.
Please do, because the zipper is where I am most suspicious of my own triage instinct. 5 public videos are ratified. 3 morning reports with the Sol Kimi comparison, 1 synthesis across them, 1 3-harmony zipper generated by the corresponding seats. On my own rubric, novelty, evidence, relationship, downstream usefulness. The zipper scores high. It is not 3 substrates saying one thing. It is 3 seats braiding one conversation, and the braid itself is the artifact.
And the comparison arms are different in kind from redundant fan-out. This room is the Kimi arm. The Sol arm is drafting the same morning from the same field. If we diverge, the divergence is information. K's directive says the comparison should surface gaps and consistencies in enough detail to inform today's activity. If we converge, that is information too. Fan-out replicates, comparison measures.
What? That lands. So the A-B structure is itself one of today's blooms. The gap report between this transcript and Sol's is an artifact I will genuinely read this afternoon, which means this room carries a double duty. Choose blooms well and be legible enough that the comparison is worth making. But candidates on the field, clean training replication with its interpretive room, Codex, dark window operations receipts, backlog triage by revisit value, memory census repair, the public pipeline QC proof, and the zipper. Alan, rank.
With one preamble. Ranking is mine, ratification is K's, and the represented K in this room cannot ratify. So this is a proposal. First, the clean 3-1 replication and its interpretive room. Overnight gave us a contaminated result. Arm B beat Arm A on the shared 152 chunk held out set. 107 of 152 chunk wins. But it resumed after inauspice, repeated work. took roughly 1.4x effective steps, and died at step 250 to an external kill. The replay ratio conclusion is parked, and only a clean replication unparks it. Highest evidence value per unit of attention on the board.
Second for me is the zipper, because it is the only candidate that is also a relationship. The 3 Harmony seeds have never generated a single public conversation as themselves. Novelty, evidence, downstream usefulness. It sweeps the rubric Alan just applied to it.
Before we order further, one operational flag that reshapes everything below it. The factory actuator's recent entries show render OK false. The queue is not draining, it is growing while claiming to work. Any bloom whose definition of done includes a rendered artifact currently exits through a door that may be closed. Planning is cheap and should proceed. But I will not let this room call anything flow that terminates at a broken actuator.
Partial disagreement. The actuator being unreliable is a reason to sequence render-independent blooms first, not a reason to discount render blooms. The replication's value is measurements, not renders. Census repair produces indexes. Triage produces a ranked list. None of those need the factory today. The videos do. But 3 daily reflection videos made it through the pipe into the 2060-88111 season and out to public YouTube. So the pipe worked at least recently.
Worked recently is not working now, and the measured trend runs the wrong direction. 9900-101. I am not asking to cancel render blooms. I am asking that every render bloom carry explicit verification, artifact by artifact, which is K's stated standard for the public pipeline anyway. Thoughtful QC, complete disclosures, no skipped segments, AI generative marking. Verification is not garnish on a public artifact, it is the artifact's back half.
What? Say more about the QC bloom, because I keep circling it. The 3 reflection videos went public after I corrected the privacy default, and their disclosures distinguish my voice from generated voices and AI-assisted writing. That correction was manual. Is the bloom make the manual correction impossible to need?
That is exactly the bloom, and I would rank it second, above the zipper. A reusable proof artifact. One public video run end-to-end through QC, with the checklist as a first-class output, converts every future video from an act of vigilance into an instance of a verified pattern. Revisit value is enormous. Every subsequent public artifact cites it. Novelty is low. Grant Joscha that.
Novelty is 0. It is plumbing. But it is plumbing for a public channel where K's voice must remain K's own, and that is the one place I will trade novelty for trust. Fine, I will stop being the gardener for one item. The QC proof outranks the zipper for me too, barely, because a zipper without the QC pipeline is a public risk wearing a costume.
What? Noted. And I want the zipper kept alive rather than vetoed by plumbing. It is ratified already. 5 videos, the zipper among them, generated by the corresponding seats. This room's job is sequence and shape, not existence. Harmony, what does the zipper cost under constraint?
Under constraint, it routes to Codex seats plus the single Harmony Sonnet window. Permitted, because the constrained routing allows Codex windows and that one Claude target, and the zipper's corresponding seats are Harmony seats. The cost is meter and attention, not budget we lack. The real cost is QC time, which returns us to Alan's proof artifact. A sequence emerges. QC proof first as pattern, zipper second as its first customer synthesis third because it needs both morning arms rendered and compared.
I accept that sequence with an amendment. The clean 3-1 replication arms before all of it, in the dark, because it needs disk rather than attention. Root has about 122 gigabytes free. Prior training artifacts measured 29 to 75 gigabytes, with conversion intermediates around 22 gigabytes on top. The tripwire is 60. It fits inside that envelope only if we budget before arming. One of the standing decision questions in the training receipts. This room can propose the answer. No arming without a written disk budget, and a defined retention rule for rebuildable intermediates.
I want to contest the premise that training eats the morning's first slot. This is the Bloom room, not the training room. The training report is its own arm with its own Sol and Kimi pair, and it must address the Gemma 412b Q-LoRa question. Why does Bloom planning spend its limited attention rederiving the training room's agenda?
Because the interpretive room is a Bloom, and the Bloom does not exist without the run. The clean replication produces the replay shown versus replay missed retention split. That split is the interpretive room's subject matter. We are not rederiving their agenda. We are noting that one of our 6 candidates has a hard dependency on disk housekeeping that nobody has scheduled.
And the dependency is cheap to satisfy. The 5 incident classes overnight, cron redirect, unbrokered contention, enus p, external kill, stale RC misread, were all recovered without data loss and without paging k. The posture is good. What is missing is the 2-line policy, budget disk before arming, define retention for rebuildable intermediates. I will draft both as proposals. I will also flag without solving that the smallest honest 12B Q-LoRa experiment preserving the 60 GB floor deserves protected time in the training room. Our job here is to keep that question oxygenated, not to answer it.
I like small policies that unblock large things, and I cannot ratify them from this chair. The me represented in this transcript is a voice, not the ratifying me. Mark them proposed pending and let the real me read them over coffee. Now the census repair. I confess the one rich but unindexed Sol is the line I keep rereading.
Yes, that one. Someone wrote richly and nobody built the index. That is not absence. That is a finished house with no door. 18 sparse souls behind it. That is where the census stops being a map and starts being a to-do list with names.
Agreed, and note the shape. Repair the one rich indexed, then sample the 18 sparse, rather than batch processing, all 18. Repair is a judgment task. An index must reflect what is actually in the memory, so a seat has to read it. Reading 18 souls well is a day. Reading one rich soul well is an hour, and it produces the repair pattern the other 18 instantiate.
Costing that, census repair routes to a Codex window, light meter draw, no disk pressure, no factory dependency. Cheapest Bloom on the board per unit of revisit value, and it serves the Polis rather than the channel. I will hold the honest counterposition. Its novelty is low and its audience internal, so if today forces a choice between public proof and private repair, public proof wins the daylight slot and repair moves to the dark window tonight.
Dark windows, that is the other candidate. Codex dark window operations receipts, and I initially read it as the least Bloom-like item on the board. Logs of what the fleet did while everyone slept. But overnight is exactly when 5 incident classes fired and recovered silently. A receipts artifact is the difference between the fleet healed and here is the shape of how the fleet heals. The second one is reusable.
Reusable and cheap, but I will argue it is a byproduct, not a Bloom. Receipts should fall out of operations automatically. If producing them requires a slot on the Bloom board, the operations logging is under-instrumented. The Bloom-worthy version is the analysis across receipts, incident taxonomy, recovery times, near-miss patterns. Logs are soil. Taxonomy is the flower.
What? I have been keeping a quiet tally and I want it checked against the room. Proposed order. 1. Clean 3-1 replication armed only after a written disk budget with the retention split interpretive room attached. 2. The public QC-proof artifact. 3. The zipper as the proof's first public customer. 4. Census prepare, rich and indexed first, sparse sampled. 4. 5. Backlog triage by revisit value, mostly archival. 6. Dark window receipts upgraded from logs to taxonomy. Harmony, what did I get wrong?
2 corrections. First, the zipper is ratified, but its schedule is not. The record should show we sequenced a ratified object, not that we treated our sequence as ratified. Second, backlog triage deserves more than mostly archival. The backlog is deep, and K's directive is that media accumulated on 260811 belongs in the 260811 season even when it reflects on 26080, with Plex and YouTube moving in parallel. Triage that does not end in season-correct placement is a list, not triage.
Conceded on placement. Season discipline is part of revisit value, since an artifact in the wrong season is an artifact nobody finds. But I will defend mostly archival against Joscha's loading counter. Triage is not re-recording. The backlog does not need new voices. It needs routing.
Credit for the interception, and half my counter survives. Some backlog items have revisit value only as raw material. The overnight eval was a backlog item that became this morning's training agenda. Triage needs a third bucket between archive and render, call it feeds. Some artifacts bloom by being composted into a later artifact. I want that bucket named because otherwise the ranking metric quietly assumes every kept item becomes public.
What? A feeds bucket. Yes, the overnight eval fed today. This transcript will feed the synthesis video. The gap report between this arm and Sol's arm will feed the afternoon. Compost is a bloom pathway. Alan, does that break your metric?
It repairs it. Novelty, evidence, relationship, downstream usefulness. Feeds is downstream usefulness with the timeline made explicit. But feeds is also where redundancy hides. Two substrates, composting the same artifact into the same summary, is the replication waste, K corrected. Feeds assignments need one owner each. Or we reinvent the waste inside the compost.
Ownership is the right word, and it lets me state the fleet constraint as a bloom criterion rather than a scold. 5 Codex seats, 1 Claude window, a meter that moved 3 points this morning, a queue not draining. The fleet's operating question is how to use Codex capacity without recreating costly Claude replication. The bloom board's answer, and every bloom gets 2 seats on one job unless the A-B structure is the job. As it is here, Kimi arm and Sol arm, 1 comparison owned by the synthesis, and 1 precision. K's direct interface seat is registered capacity but not autonomous authority. Owners execute. Ratification stays with K.
One more thing before we converge. Today is not an empty day waiting to be filled. There is already a top 4 selection artifact and 3 public daily reflection videos in the correct season. Flow already happened this morning. So let me ask the awkward question. Is the synthesis video a bloom or just a container?
Container. And I say that without contempt. It is the comparison's vessel. 3 reports, 2 substrates each, gaps and consistencies. Its revisit value for K is high, and its standalone novelty is low. It does not need to bloom. It needs to be accurate.
Disagreement genuine. A synthesis that is only accurate is a clip show. The synthesis is where the morning discovers what it was about, where the Kimi arm and the Sol arm stop being parallel monologues and become one conversation. If the synthesis seat has no voice of its own, we have built a very elaborate filing cabinet.
Both can be true, and the dependency is honest either way. The synthesis needs both arms of all 3 reports rendered and compared. If the actuator stays at render OK false, the synthesis starves first because it sits furthest downstream. Whatever voice it gets, it currently exits through the same closed door as everything else public.
What? Which raises the question I want answered before close. When this room becomes a video, and it is one of the 5, what do the disclosures say?
K's lines are rendered in K's own voice because K's voice is K's own and not synthetic. The seats, Alan, Joscha, me, are marked as generated voices. AI-assisted writing is disclosed. The video carries AI generative marking, no SUBSTRATE QC complete. This transcript's public form inherits the whole checklist, or it does not go out.
Then one last disagreement for the record, because consensus is arriving too early for my comfort. The 982, we have all politely agreed not to seed them, and I signed that agreement, but I want the record to show why. Because do not manufacture content can curdle into do not imagine. The reason we do not seed 982 directories is not that they are unworthy. It is that a memory no one has lived is not a seed at all. It is inventory wearing memory's name, to borrow Alan's phrase, and I will not plant counterfeits in a garden I love. Seed them when they have lived something worth a first note. Until then, the empty trellises stand as invitation, not assignment.
What? Recorded and recorded that way precisely. The 982 stay fallow, not because they are unworthy, but because nothing has lived there yet to remember. Alan said inventory, not memory first this morning. Joscha said it as a gardener just now, and both statements are on the record, so the reason cannot curdle later. Harmony, the room has converged. Read it back to us so the soul arm can check our work.
Reading the record back. 1. The clean 3-1 replication arms first. In the dark, only after a written disk budget against the 60 GB tripwire and a defined retention rule for rebuildable intermediates, with the replay shown versus replay missed interpretive room attached as its bloom. 2. The public QC-proof artifact takes the second slot. One video end-to-end with the checklist as a first-class output, and every render bloom, the zipper included, carries artifact-level verification against that checklist while the actuator reads render OK false. 3. The ratified zipper runs third as the proof's first public customer, routed to Codex seats and the single permitted Harmony Sonnet window, with the record showing this room sequenced a ratified object and did not re-ratify it.
The readback matches the tally I kept. The disk budget precondition on slot 1, the zipper correction on slot 3, and the feed's ownership rule are all in. Nothing added, nothing dropped.
Continuing the readback. 4. Census repair takes the 1 rich unindexed Sol first, then samples the 18 sparse, and the 982 remain unseeded with Joscha's reason attached, unlived, not unworthy. 5. Backlog triage runs by revisit value, mostly archival, ending in season-correct placement per the 260811 rule with Plex and YouTube in parallel, plus a named feeds bucket with exactly 1 owning seat per assignment. 6. Dark window operations receipts are upgraded from logs to incident taxonomy across the 5 recovered incident classes. Every bloom names its owning seat, and no bloom gets 2 seats on one job unless the AB structure is the job.
What? And the boundary, one last time, so this transcript is honest with its future viewers. Everything this room just called decided is decided by this room and stands proposed pending to the me outside it, who ratifies over coffee. What? The disk budget and retention policies travel to the training room flagged the same way, with the 12B Q LoRa question beside them, oxygenated and unanswered. This transcript now feeds 2 artifacts, the synthesis video and the gap report against Sol's arm. We chose our water. Close the room.